There is a sound a Soviet centrifugal turbojet makes when it spools up. A rising hollow moan, quite unlike the harder shriek of an American engine of the same era. In the early months of 1969, that sound was coming off a dry alkali lakebed in the Nevada desert, in daylight, with the sun on the wings. The airplane making it was a MiG-17. It wore United States markings and a false serial number. It had been built in Poland, delivered to Syria, and landed by accident in Israel. Among the Navy officers assigned to fly, it was Lieutenant Commander Ronald McKeown, and the assignment translated in plain language to beat American fighter crews with it over and over until they stopped losing where it counted. The desert around it was empty and fenced and did not appear on any public map. 8,000 miles away, a war was going badly. For 4 years, the MiG-17 had been the airplane. The United States could not answer. It was subsonic. It had no radar worth the name and no missiles at all. It had been designed in the early 1950s and was already obsolete on paper by the time it reached Southeast Asia. And it had spent 4 years knocking down the most advanced fighter aircraft in the American inventory. The United States tried missiles, and the missiles missed. It tried heavier fighters, and the heavier fighters could not turn. It tried faster fighters, and the faster fighters overshot. It tried firepower and discovered that the newest American interceptor had been built without a gun at all. Every technological advantage the United States held over North Vietnam was real, and none of it mattered. Inside a 2-mile circle of sky at 3,000 feet, there was a particular sting in which airplane was doing it. The MiG-17 was old. It was a direct development of the MiG-15, the fighter American pilots had fought over the Yalu River during the Korean War. It first flew in 1950 and entered Soviet service in 1952. The United States had already met this airframe's parent in combat, studied it, captured an example of it, and written it off as a solved problem. 15 years later, the improved version was killing American aircrew at a rate the Pentagon could not explain. The place where McCown was standing was called Groom Lake. It sits in the Nevada desert inside a restricted area that, at the time, did not officially exist. It was roughly 8,000 miles from Hanoi, and the distance was the point. This was as far from the war as an American fighter pilot could get and still be in uniform. The date was in the spring of 1969. The bombing of North Vietnam had been halted the previous November, which meant the American fighter force had been handed something rarer than a new weapon. It had been handed time. Everyone at Groom Lake understood the arithmetic. The halt would not last. When the aircraft went back north, they would meet the same MiGs flown by the same pilots, and unless something fundamental changed in the interval, they would get the same result. The number that defined the problem was the exchange ratio. When the Navy convened its own review of the air war, the figure written into the charter was that American fighters were trading with North Vietnamese fighters at best at about 2.5 to 1. The claimed American figure from the Korean War had been several times better than that. A generation of enormous technological investment had produced a fighter force that appeared to be performing worse against its enemy than its fathers had performed less than 20 years earlier. Before we go further, I want to ask something small. Cold War Impact is an independent channel, and the reach on these documentaries has fallen sharply in recent months. If you find this kind of research worth your time, subscribing costs you nothing, and a comment or a share genuinely moves a video in front of people who would never otherwise find it. It is the difference between this channel continuing to make deep dives like this one and not. Now back to the desert. Across the wall, American aircrew fired 612 radar-guided Sparrow missiles in combat over Southeast Asia. 97 of them hit something. 56 of them destroyed an enemy aircraft. That is a kill rate of a little over 9% for the most sophisticated air-to-air weapon the United States possessed. The heat-seeking Sidewinder did better and still failed most of the time. 452 of those were fired for a kill probability of roughly 18%, producing 82 destroyed aircraft against a peacetime test expectation of 65%. The failure was not concentrated in one bad year. It ran the length of the conflict. The weapon that finally broke the MiG-17 was not a new missile. It was not a new fighter. It was not more bombs or a lifted rule of engagement or the arrival of some classified prototype from a desert hangar. It was two second-hand Soviet fighters that had been flown into Israeli territory by two Syrian pilots who were lost. They were lost because they were navigating with charts, printed before the State of Israel existed. Nobody planned it, nobody paid for it. The single most valuable piece of air combat intelligence the United States acquired during the Vietnam War arrived because two junior officers made a wrong turn. But to understand why two stray airplanes mattered so much, we have to go back 4 years to a morning in April of 1965, when the United States discovered that it had built an air force that could not fight. The target was a bridge. The North Vietnamese called it Ham Rong, the Dragon's Jaw. It carried the road and rail line across the Song Ma River near Than Hoa, and it was one of the few structures in North Vietnam whose destruction would have produced a real operational effect. American planners had been staring at it for months. The official position of the United States military that April was that the North Vietnamese Air Force was not a serious factor. It was small, newly formed, flying obsolete equipment, and thought to be barely trained. Strike planners treated the MiG threat as a nuisance to be noted in a briefing, and then set aside. That assessment was reasonable on paper, TAS. It was also wrong, and the correction arrived within 48 hours. On April 3, 1965, the Navy went in first. 4 MiG-17s of the newly formed 921st Fighter Regiment came up against Crusaders of Fighter, Squadron 211, flying from the carrier Hancock. The North Vietnamese flew a two-element ambush, one pair acting as bait, the other pair positioned to attack from a blind quarter. It was not the behavior of an untrained force. The element led by Pham Unjo Clan closed and fired, and an F-8 Crusader flown by Lieutenant Commander Spence Thomas was hit hard enough that he could not recover aboard the ship and had to put down at Da Nang. The North Vietnamese claimed 2 Crusaders shot down. American records confirm 1 aircraft damaged and none lost. That gap between the claim and the record is worth noticing early because it recurs for the next 8 years and it distorts almost every popular account of this war. But the tactical fact underneath the claim was solid. A 4-year-old Air Force had set up an ambush against a first-line American fighter squadron and made it work. Vietnam still celebrates April 3 as the founding day of its Air Force. The next morning belonged to the Air Force, and it went far worse. On April 4, 1965, 48 F-105 Thunderchiefs of the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing went back to the Dragon's Jaw. The Thunderchief was the largest single-engine fighter ever built for the United States. It weighed more loaded than a World War II medium bomber. It had been designed to carry a nuclear weapon at very low altitude and very high speed into Soviet airspace, and it did that job superbly. On this particular morning, it was carrying iron bombs at medium altitude in daylight over a defended target, which is close to the opposite of everything it had been optimized for. The escort came from the 416th Tactical Fighter Squadron, flying F-100 Super Sabres. The Super Sabre was an older airplane, but it was a gunfighter, and it was the only thing in the package that had been built with a turning fight in mind. The men flying the Strike were not amateurs. They were career officers, most with thousands of hours, many with experience going back to Korea. What they did not have was recent practice at maneuvering against another fighter. In the years after Korea, the American services had concluded that the guided missile had ended the close-in dogfight. Air combat maneuvering had been cut back sharply in the training pipeline and in some communities effectively abandoned. The Navy had dissolved its dedicated gunnery unit in 1960. A pilot could arrive in a fighter squadron in 1965, having never fought another airplane in his life. The strike package carried missiles and bombs. It did not carry any practiced answer to the specific problem of a small, agile, cannon-armed fighter arriving from below. 4 MiG-17s came out of the haze under ground control. They did not try to work their way into a firing position through a turning engagement. They accelerated through the escort in a single diving pass, went straight for the bomb carriers, fired, and left. 2 Thunderchiefs went down. The pilots, Captain James Magnuson and Major Frank Bennett, were both killed. They were the first American aircraft lost to enemy fighters in the war. Two North Vietnamese pilots were credited with them, the flight leader Tran Han and his element leader Le Minh Wan, and it is worth saying plainly that the sources disagree about which man shot down which aircraft. Vietnamese accounts and Western accounts pair them in opposite ways, and no record settles it. The insult was not that the enemy was skillful. The insult was how little the attack required. There was no elaborate maneuver, no sustained fight, no contest of pilot against pilot. 4 subsonic airplanes drove through an escorted formation of 48 modern fighter bombers, took what they came for, and disengaged. The escort was in the wrong place, at the wrong speed, watching the wrong piece of sky. One American came close to reversing it. Captain Donald Kilgus, flying one of the Super Sabres, got behind a MiG-17 and fired his cannon into it. He watched it go down toward the ground, trailing smoke. He was credited with a probable rather than a confirmed kill. The formal reason was the one that governs every such claim, which is that nobody witnessed a crash or an ejection. Several historians have added a second layer, arguing that Washington at that stage of the war was reluctant to publicize confirmed victories over Soviet-built aircraft that might have been flown by Soviet or Chinese personnel. That is an interpretation rather than a documented ruling, and it deserves to be labeled as one. If Kilgus had been credited, the first American air-to-air victory of the Vietnam War would have been scored with a gun by the oldest fighter in the package on the same morning the missile age failed its first examination. North Vietnam paid for that morning as well. 3 of the 4 MiG-17s were lost with their pilots, Le Minh Hoan, Pham Gia, and Tran Nguyen Nam. Tran Han alone came home. Any honest account of the air war has to hold both facts at once. The MiG-17 was lethal, and the MiG-17 was fragile, and the men flying it were spending their lives at a rate the United States never had to match. There is a detail about that bridge that makes the whole episode harder to look at. The Dragon's Jaw survived. It survived April, and it survived the rest of 1965, and it survived 1966 and 1967. Air Force accounting puts the campaign against that one river crossing at something in the order of 871 sorties at a cost of roughly 11 aircraft. And the structure stayed up. It was finally dropped in May of 1972 by Phantoms carrying laser-guided bombs, a weapon that did not exist when Frank Bennett and James Magnuson were killed trying to hit it with iron. So the price of April 4 was 2 dead pilots and 2 lost aircraft in exchange for nothing, against an objective that would not fall for another 7 years. That is the shape of the entire problem in miniature. It was not that the United States lacked power. It was that the power it had was being applied through a set of assumptions that did not survive contact. The most conspicuous of those assumptions was the gun. The Phantom had been designed as a fleet interceptor. Its purpose was to launch from a carrier, be vectored by a controller to a Soviet bomber, and destroy it with radar-guided missiles at a distance. In that mission, a cannon is dead weight. So the F-4B, the F-4C, and the F-4D were all built without one. When the airplane found itself in a close-range turning fight over North Vietnam, its crews had missiles that would not arm inside about 3,000 feet and nothing whatsoever for the range at which the fight was actually taking place. The interim answer was a gun pod bolted under the centerline. It worked, in the sense that it fired. It also added drag, cost the airplane performance in exactly the regime where it could least afford to lose any, and mounted the weapon on a pylon that flexed, which meant the rounds did not go reliably where the sight said they would. Crews used it, and some of them scored with it, and nobody who flew it mistook it for an internal cannon. The Phantom did not receive a proper built-in gun until the F-4E entered combat toward the end of 1968, more than 3 years after the type first met a MiG-17. And then it got worse because the problem was not confined to one bridge or one morning. Over the following 3 years, the pattern hardened. American fighters would arrive with a technological advantage that dissolved on contact. Crews were forbidden by the rules of engagement from firing at a radar contact they had not seen with their own eyes, which erased the entire reason for carrying a long-range radar-guided missile. When they closed to visual range, they were inside the Sparrow's minimum launch distance. The missiles themselves had been designed and tested against aircraft, flying straight and level at high altitude, and they had never been asked to track a target, pulling hard at low level over a river delta. The Air Force compounded it with a weapon of its own. The Falcon was a missile designed to be fired by an interceptor at a bomber under the direction of a computer, and it had no proximity fuse, which meant it had to physically strike the target to detonate. Fitted to Phantoms and pointed at a maneuvering fighter, it produced almost nothing. Across the entire war, 54 of them were launched and 5 aerial victories resulted. Colonel Robin Olds, who commanded a Phantom wing and who scored 4 MiG kills himself, eventually had his aircraft rewired so that his crews could carry sidewinders instead. That is what the situation had come to. A wing commander in the middle of a war was modifying his own airplanes to get rid of the missile his service had issued him. It would be wrong to suggest the Americans never outthought the North Vietnamese. On January 2, 1967, Olds ran an operation that remains one of the most elegant deceptions in the history of air combat. His Phantoms flew the exact route, at the exact altitude and speed, using the exact radio call signs and the exact electronic jamming pods associated with a Thunderchief bombing raid. North Vietnamese controllers, seeing what they expected to see, sent MiG-21s up through the cloud to intercept a bomber formation. They arrived in the middle of a formation of air superiority fighters that had nothing to jettison and nothing else to do. 7 MiG-21s were claimed shot down in the space of a few minutes against no American losses. North Vietnamese records admit 5. Even at the lower figure, it was the heaviest single blow the MiG-21 force had taken. It was a brilliant operation, and it changed nothing structural, for the obvious reason that it could only be done once. The North Vietnamese adjusted, and it had been an ambush at altitude against the MiG-21, which was never the airplane at the center of the problem. Down at 3,000 feet, in the turning fight against the cannon-armed MiG-17, the Americans had no equivalent trick and no equivalent answer. The maintenance story was worse than the engineering story. Missiles were being carried on combat sortie after combat sortie without being fired, absorbing catapult launches and arrested landings, cooking on steel decks in tropical humidity, and then being expected to work. A disposable contact meant to be replaced before every flight was routinely left in place, until it corroded. None of this was a secret from the men flying. What made it unbearable was the growing suspicion that the answer already existed, in a building, in a safe, in a country most of them could not have found on a map. The North Vietnamese Air Force was not an improvisation. It was a deliberate, patient, and extremely well-conceived instrument. And understanding why it worked is the only way to understand what the Americans eventually had to do about it. Its senior officers had begun training in China around 1960, first on the MiG-15 and then on the MiG-17. Others went to the Soviet Union. On February 3, 1964, the order establishing the 921st Fighter Regiment was signed, and the Soviet Union delivered 36 aircraft as a gift. The regiment and its airplanes initially stayed in China. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, they were recalled, and on August 6, 1964, MiG-17s landed at Noi Bai, the field the Americans called Phuc Hien. A second regiment, the 923rd, was formed in September of 1965, with pilots returning from Krasnodar and from China. The scale was tiny. At the start of 1965, North Vietnam had roughly 36 MiG-17s and roughly the same number of qualified pilots. Against them stood the combined tactical air power of the United States, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. The North Vietnamese never attempted to contest the air. They attempted something much harder and much smarter, which was to make the air expensive. Their doctrine rested on ground-controlled interception. A network of radars and controllers tracked incoming strike packages and vectored small groups of MiGs to a precise point in space at a precise moment, usually from below and behind, usually out of the sun or the haze. The MiGs would make one pass. If a Thunderchief pilot jettisoned his bombs to fight, the mission had already been defeated whether or not anyone was shot down. Vietnamese accounts of the period describe it as guerrilla warfare in the air, and the description is exact. The airplane suited the doctrine perfectly. The MiG-17 carried a wing loading in the region of 50 pounds per square foot, rising toward 55 when fully loaded. The Phantoms ran somewhere between 78 and 86, depending on what it was carrying. That single comparison explains most of the war in the low-altitude arena. It was stressed to 8 times the force of gravity. Its armament was concentrated in the nose, one 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannon, and a short burst from that battery would destroy any airplane it touched. It was small, and it left almost no smoke trail, which mattered enormously against an American fighter whose engines produced a plume visible for miles. Not all of the aircraft were Soviet. A significant proportion of North Vietnam's fleet consisted of Chinese-built copies produced under license by the Shenyang Works, functionally identical machines from a factory the Americans were forbidden to attack. A dozen radar-equipped night fighter variants arrived in 1965, giving the force a limited all-weather capability it had not previously possessed. The force also grew. From roughly 36 fighters in 1965, North Vietnamese fighter strength reached something on the order of 180 aircraft and 72 qualified pilots by 1968. On March 24, 1967, the fighter regiments were consolidated under a single air division, giving the force a proper operational headquarters for the first time. It was also, for most of the war, effectively untouchable on the ground. American rules of engagement placed the principal airfields off-limits for long stretches and drew restricted zones around Hanoi, Haiphong, and the Chinese border. A North Vietnamese pilot could take off, fight, and land, and the field he landed on was frequently a legally protected sanctuary. Few air forces in history have been handed that particular advantage over a stronger opponent. The pilots were extraordinary. Nguyen Van Bay was a farmer's son from the Mekong Delta, who had left home at 16 to fight the French and had never seen the inside of a machine more complicated than a bicycle. He said later that he went from the bicycle to the airplane with no stop in between. During flight training, he suffered so badly from air sickness that he cut the top off a ball and tied it around his neck to catch it, rather than admit he was struggling. He would finish the war as the highest-scoring MiG-17 pilot in North Vietnamese service, credited by his own Air Force with 7 American aircraft. One of his airplanes came home with more than 80 holes in it. He was not alone. O Yo Hui Chow and Lei Hai each finished the war credited by their own service with 6 American aircraft, and every one of those claims was scored in the MiG-17. All 3 men built their reputations in a design that had first flown in 1950 and entered service in 1952. An airframe the Soviet Union had already begun pushing out of its own frontline units before the fighting in Vietnam even started. When the MiG-21 arrived in 1966, the North Vietnamese did not replace the MiG-17. They divided the labor. The MiG-21 was the high-speed interceptor, coming down out of altitude with missiles and leaving again. The MiG-17 worked low, where its turning advantage was overwhelming and where American strike aircraft were obliged to go in order to hit anything. This was a tendency rather than a rule, and both types were used outside it when circumstances demanded, but as a description of how the 2 aircraft earned their keep, it holds. All of it rested on one assumption. The North Vietnamese command believed, with excellent evidence, that the United States would not solve the low-altitude turning fight. Not because the Americans lacked the aircraft or the pilots, but because American doctrine had spent a decade insisting that this kind of combat was extinct. An air force that has told itself the dogfight is over does not train for the dogfight, does not write tactics for the dogfight, and cannot suddenly produce them under fire. That assumption held for 4 years. It was about to be tested by a program that almost nobody in the American fighter force was cleared to know about. There had been one earlier attempt to face the problem honestly. In the middle of the decade, the Air Force ran a series of trials pitting its heavy fighters against small, agile aircraft chosen to behave like a MiG-17, and the trials produced sensible conclusions about speed and the vertical. They were also conducted without a MiG, read by relatively few people, and overtaken by events. Nobody built an institution around them. The precedent that mattered was set by an airplane. The United States acquired 3 years before it got its hands on a MiG-17, and the story of that acquisition is the reason the second one was possible. In August of 1966, an Iraqi Air Force pilot named Munir Redfar took off in a MiG-21 and did not come back. He flew to Israel and landed at Hatzor. It was the conclusion of a long and patient Israeli intelligence operation, and it delivered into Western hands the most modern Soviet fighter in service, complete, undamaged, with its manuals. The Israelis flew it, learned what they needed, and then loaned it to the United States. From January to April of 1968, at Groom Lake, the American military evaluated a genuine Soviet MiG-21 under a program called Have Donut. It was given a false American designation so that it could appear in ordinary flight paperwork without raising questions. Air Force and Navy pilots flew against it. The resulting technical report filled several hundred pages, and it was, by any measure, an intelligence triumph. The arithmetic that made it worth doing was not subtle. Every previous American assessment of Soviet fighters had been assembled from photographs, defector interviews, radar tracks, and captured manuals. Have Donut replaced all of that with a flight test card. For the first time, American energy maneuverability charts for a Soviet fighter were drawn from actual measured performance rather than estimate. And it did not fix the war. It failed for two reasons, and neither of them is heroic. The first is that it was the wrong airplane. The MiG-21 was a real threat, but it was a high-altitude missile shooter that fought the way American doctrine expected an enemy to fight. The airplane that was actually killing Americans down in the weeds in the turning fight with cannon was the MiG-17, and nobody had one. The second reason is the one that mattered more, and it is almost absurd. The findings were classified so tightly that the men who needed them could not be told. The intelligence was excellent, and it was locked in a vault. A squadron pilot preparing to fly into Route Package 6 had no clearance, no access, and no realistic mechanism by which the contents of that report could reach him before he needed it. The United States had discovered the answer and then filed it where the question could not reach. The material was not withheld out of malice or stupidity. It was withheld because the security architecture built to protect the source was working exactly as designed, and nobody had built a corresponding architecture for getting the lessons out. A classification stamp, applied correctly by people following the rules, cost American aircrew the better part of a year. Munir Redfer, the man who made it possible, never went home and never flew for his own Air Force again. He lived out his life abroad under protection and died of a heart attack in the late 1990s. His name appeared in no American citation. The program he enabled was still classified when the war he helped shape was over. When the Americans finally got a MiG-17 and put it through the same process, the results were not ambiguous. They were closer to a verdict. The declassified tactical evaluation puts the central finding almost brutally. The MiG-17 was capable of defeating any United States Navy tactical airplane in a turning fight below roughly 450 to 475 knots indicated. Not some airplanes. Any of them. The Phantom, the Crusader, the Skyhawk, the Intruder, the Corsair. The evaluators singled out 300 to 350 knots as the band where it was at its most dangerous, and their own summary of that band was that they could not outturn it. The raw specifications explain why. The MiG-17 was powered by a single engine producing roughly 6,000 pounds of thrust, dry, and about 7,500 pounds with afterburner. A Phantom carried two engines each, producing more than double that figure. On paper, the mismatch is absurd. But the MiG weighed a little over 8,000 pounds empty and about 12,000 ready to fight. A Phantom, loaded for a combat sortie, weighed somewhere around 40,000. The whole of that extra power was being spent hauling the extra weight around the turn. Thrust wins races, wing loading wins turns. In a horizontal circle at low speed, the small airplane with the big wing takes the small airplane with the big engine every time, and no amount of technology in the cockpit changes the physics of it. That is the bad half. The other half is the war-winning half, and it is equally specific. Above 450 knots, the MiG-17 begins to come apart as a fighting machine. Its controls stiffen severely. Its roll rate falls away almost to nothing. Beyond about Mach 0.85, the pilot is fighting the airplane as much as the enemy. It develops a pronounced Dutch roll above 375 knots that degrades gun tracking precisely when tracking matters most. Its gun battery, so devastating on contact, holds only about 6 seconds of total firing time. The shells travel comparatively slowly, which means the pilot must establish and hold a large lead angle for 2 to 3 seconds before the rounds arrive. Against an aircraft flying predictably, that is easy. Against an aircraft that is unloading and rolling, it is close to impossible. Its fuel state is the other quiet catastrophe. Combat radius was on the order of 115 nautical miles clean. The airplane could not loiter, could not pursue, and could not afford a long engagement. Every second at full throttle cost it something it could not replace, and it could not go up. Every American type tested against it, the Phantom, the Thunderchief, the Super Sabre, and the little F-5, held clear superiority in the vertical. The MiG-17 also had a blind zone below the horizon that a pilot who understood it could live in. The evaluation reduced the whole problem to a rule that a squadron pilot could actually use. Keep the speed above 500 knots. Do not pull hard below 500 knots. Fight in the vertical, never in a sustained horizontal turn. If the situation is bad, leave, and as the Tactical Air Command version of the report put it, if you get away, do not go back unless it is on your terms. So, the fight was already decided in the American favor, on paper, and had been for years. It would remain a paper victory unless 3 conditions were met. The crews had to actually know what they were facing in specific numbers rather than rumor. They had to be trained to fly the answer, which meant reversing a decade of doctrine. And the knowledge had to physically escape the classification system that had swallowed the last set of findings. The rest of this story is those 3 conditions being met with a war running on a clock. The airplanes arrived by accident on August 12, 1968. 2 Syrian Air Force MiG-17s took off on a training navigation flight and crossed into Lebanese airspace. Somewhere over the Bekaa, they should have turned north toward Tripoli. They turned south instead. Investigations afterward established that the pilots were flying with obsolete charts that predated the political geography they were flying over. They descended, saw a runway, and landed at an abandoned strip called Betset in northern Israel, believing they were still in Lebanon. The Israelis initially assumed they had received 2 defectors. They had not. They had received 2 extremely embarrassed young officers, and, more importantly, 2 airworthy MiG-17 fighters. Israeli test pilots put both machines through a short evaluation that autumn under Colonel Danny Shapira, the chief test pilot who had also been first to fly the captured MiG-21 2 years earlier. Their finding previewed everything the Americans would later measure. The airplane possessed a remarkable ability to hold a stabilized turn in the band between 200 and 350 knots, which is precisely the speed range in which a loaded American strike aircraft over North Vietnam spent most of its working life. The 2 aircraft were then transferred to the United States. Their handling tells you how seriously the program was taken. The first arrived at Groom Lake on January 27, 1969, under the codename Have Drill. It was not even a Soviet-built machine. It was a Polish license-built example, an airframe with a construction number placing its manufacture in the mid-1950s. It first flew in American hands on February 17, 1969. The second airframe arrived on March 12 under the codename Have Ferry and first flew on April 9. The first of the 2 carried the test equipment. It was instrumented to record its own performance and fitted with a periscope and a ranging radar. The second was the spare and received neither. Both were assigned false American designations and false serial numbers so that their movements could be recorded in routine Department of Defense flight logs without anyone outside the program understanding what had just landed. Security governed the flying schedule itself. Sorties were planned around the orbits of Soviet reconnaissance satellites so that the airplanes were on the ground and undercover whenever there was something overhead to photograph them. The whole enterprise ran on the assumption that its greatest vulnerability was not an accident, but a photograph. And then came the decision that made the entire enterprise worth something. The decision that separated Have Drill from Have Donut. The obvious course was to fly the airplane, measure everything, write a definitive report, classify it appropriately, and distribute it to those cleared to receive it. That is what had been done before. It had produced excellent intelligence and no change in behavior. Instead, the program was structured around a different objective. Rather than maximize the quality of the document, It would maximize the number of human beings who had personally been beaten by a MiG-17. Squadrons would send crews out on what looked like an ordinary training sortie. They would be jumped without warning by the real thing. They would lose. Then they would land and be told what had just happened to them and be taught how to make it come out differently. The evaluation stated the outcome without any decoration. Every Navy pilot engaged in the project, it recorded, lost his first engagement with the MiG-17. All of them had seriously underestimated it. Those are the words of the document rather than of any individual pilot. And the flatness of the phrasing is the point. It only made sense to have as many aircrew as possible make their first mistake somewhere that was not lethal. The program had about 5 months and 2 airplanes with which to do it. Between February and the end of June 1969, the 2 captured fighters flew 224 sorties. The first aircraft accounted for 172 of them, about 131 flying hours across 55 days. The second added 52 sorties and under 38 hours across 20 days. Tactical Air Command flew 57 missions against them. The Navy flew 47. Air Defense Command sent 23, split between 3 types of Continental Interceptor. What happened to the crews on those sorties was consistent enough to be predictable. A pair of American fighters would be working a routine engagement in a training area they had used 100 times. Something small and silver would appear where nothing was supposed to be, arriving from a direction that made no sense, and for a second or two the shape would refuse to resolve into anything from their own inventory. Then it would be inside their turn, then it would be behind them. There was very little time in which to be confused. The pilots who came back down were not humiliated so much as reorganized. Every assumption they had carried into the air about what their own aircraft could and could not do had just been revised by direct experience rather than by a briefing slide, and the revision held. That was the entire product of the program, not a document. A change in what a specific set of human beings believed. The results came apart by aircraft type, and each type produced a different lesson. The Phantom, the airplane carrying the largest share of the burden over North Vietnam, learned that its problem was not performance, but permission. Flown as doctrine prescribed, decelerating into a turning contest to bring weapons to bear, it lost. Flown fast and vertically, refusing the turning fight entirely, extending away and returning on its own terms, it won consistently. The airplane had always been capable of beating a MiG-17. The tactics in the manual had been preventing it. But today, the evaluation added a specific and unwelcome finding for the Phantom community that its radar and radar-guided missile effectiveness fell away sharply when the MiG operated at or below 10,000 feet above the ground, which is exactly where the MiG operated. The Crusader, the Navy's dedicated gun-armed fighter and the closest American match for the MiG's arena, learned a subtler lesson. It could live in the fight longer than the Phantom, and that was the danger. Its ability to stay in a turning engagement tempted its pilots into staying in one, which is precisely the engagement the numbers said they would eventually lose. The attack aircraft learned the bluntest lesson of all. For the Skyhawk, the Intruder and the Corsair, the findings pointed one way only. There was no version of this fight. They won. The correct response was to leave. It is a rare thing for an evaluation to conclude that an entire community of aviators should decline the engagement, and the numbers left very little room for anything else. And the Air Force types, the Thunderchief and the Super Sabre, confirmed the vertical solution from the other direction. Even the heavy, unloved Thunderchief, the airplane that had been humiliated over the Dragon's Jaw 4 years earlier, held a vertical advantage over the MiG-17. It had always held it. Nobody had been taught to use it. Air Defense Command brought the strangest participants of all. Its business was intercepting Soviet bombers over North America, and it sent aircraft built purely for that purpose, machines optimized for straight-line speed and radar performance, with no pretense at maneuvering combat. They were never going to fight a MiG-17 over Vietnam, and everyone knew it. What that community took away instead was the conclusion that reshaped American procurement, which was that an interceptor designed on the assumption that it would never be forced into close combat was an interceptor that had made a bet nobody could guarantee. 2 captured fighters, 224 sorties, roughly 5 months. Not a single American aircraft lost in the process, and not one of the participating pilots ever again had to meet a MiG-17 for the first time in a place where the mistake would kill him. The aftermath was not glamorous. The evaluation team wrote its conclusions in language that must have been painful to put on paper. It found that the MiG's capabilities should have surprised no one and attributed American losses to overconfidence, complacency, and poor training. It noted that the dramatic improvement in aircrew performance after a single simulated engagement illustrated the absence of realistic training more clearly than any argument could. Air Defense Command added one recommendation that reshaped American fighter procurement for the next half-century: that all future United States fighter developments include a gun as well as missiles. Then the airplanes were put away, the program stayed classified, and the men who had flown against them returned to their units carrying something they were not permitted to explain. The findings landed in a service that had already decided something had to change. In 1968, the Chief of Naval Operations had handed Captain Frank Ault a broad charter to find out why Navy missiles were not killing anything. Ault was an unusual choice in that he had commanded the carrier Coral Sea and watched his own air wing lose around 50 aircraft in combat while scoring a single air-to-air victory. Most of those losses were to anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles rather than to MiGs, so the comparison is not a clean measure of the fighter problem. It was, however, the kind of arithmetic a commanding officer does not forget. He was not investigating a theoretical problem. Ault pulled in pilots, program managers, and engineers from the companies that built the missiles and the radars, and produced a document running to hundreds of pages. The number of recommendations it contained is usually given as around 240, though the Naval Institute's own account of it puts the figure at closer to 100, so treat any precise count with suspicion. What is not disputed is the breadth. It examined manufacturing quality, shipboard handling, maintenance intervals, and the launch envelopes that crews had never been taught. Its most consequential recommendation was not about hardware at all. It called for an advanced fighter weapons school. On March 3, 1969, 5 weeks after the first captured MiG-17 arrived in Nevada, the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School was established at Miramar under an existing training squadron. Its first officer in charge was Lieutenant Commander Dan Pedersen, who selected 8 instructors and an intelligence officer. They had no building, no aircraft of their own, and no budget worth the name. They worked out of a stolen trailer. The instructions they received from their commanding officer were reportedly limited to not killing anybody and not losing an airplane. They built a graduate-level air combat syllabus in about 60 days. Because they could not put a real MiG in front of a student, they built substitutes. The small, nimble Skyhawk stood in for the MiG-17. Borrowed Air Force trainers stood in for the MiG-21. The point was dissimilar combat, fighting an airplane that did not fly like your own, which was the one thing American training had systematically avoided. And behind the syllabus sat the numbers from Nevada, transmitted to students not as a document, but as a repeated, physical experience. There was one more design decision, and it was the one that solved the problem that had killed. Have donut. The school did not try to teach classified material. It taught behavior. A student was never told where the numbers came from. He was simply put into an engagement, beaten by an instructor flying like a MiG-17, and then shown the specific speed and the specific maneuver that would have saved him. The lesson traveled at the speed of flying hours rather than at the speed of security clearances, and it multiplied. Graduates went back to their squadrons as instructors and taught everyone else. A school with fewer than a dozen staff and no aircraft of its own reached the entire Navy fighter community in about 3 years, which is something no report has ever done. The first return came quickly. On March 28, 1970, Lieutenant Jerry Bollier, a graduate of the school's first class, shot down a MiG-21. It was the Navy's first MiG kill since the bombing halt, and it came from the first 8 men the school ever taught. The real verdict came in the spring of 1972, when the bombing of the North resumed and the two air forces met again after 3.5 years apart. On May 10, 1972, Navy fighters shot down 7 MiG-17s and a MiG-21 in a single day. not one of them was lost to an enemy fighter. No day in the entire war cost the North Vietnamese Air Force more. 2 men from Fighter Squadron 96, Randall Cunningham and his radar intercept officer William Driscoll, scored 3 of them and became the Navy's only aces of the conflict. The qualifier matters though, and it is the kind of thing usually left out. Cunningham and Driscoll did not bring their airplane home. A surface-to-air missile hit them on the way out, and they ejected over the water. The MiGs did not touch them. Everything else in North Vietnam still could. The change was not incremental. It was a category change. For 7 years, American aircrew had flown around the MiG-17, structuring entire missions to avoid the piece of sky where it lived. Now they were flying through it. That is where most accounts of this story stop, and that is where most accounts of this story become misleading. The Navy's improvement was real and measurable. Across the war, its fighters finished with an exchange ratio near 3.5 to 1 against an Air Force figure close to 2, and in 1972 the gap widened sharply in the Navy's favor. School graduates scored a disproportionate share of the kills. The precise ratios quoted for individual months and campaigns vary so much between sources, depending on whether marine losses are counted and whether all aircraft or only fighters are included, that the honest statement is the comparative one. The Navy got better. The Air Force, at first, did not. The Air Force did not experience it because the Air Force had not done what the Navy did. The Air Force response to the same crisis had been analytical rather than institutional. It commissioned detailed studies of every air combat engagement of the war, and those studies were rigorous, and they did not translate into a school. Air Force crews went back north in 1972, still flying rigid 4-ship formations in which only the leader was expected to shoot, and the wingman existed largely to protect him. Against an enemy that attacked from below in pairs, that formation produced casualties. Through June and July of 1972, the Air Force lost around 13 aircraft to MiGs while shooting down about 11, a period that included a stretch of consecutive losses with nothing in return. The commander of 7th Air Force, General John Vought, reported to the Chief of Staff that his service was losing the air war. This is roughly 3 years after Half Drill, and it is the strongest available evidence against the simple story in which one classified test program fixed American air combat. What fixed it for the Air Force was mostly not training. In August of 1972, a facility in Thailand began fusing signals intelligence into real-time warnings and passing them directly to airborne crews. The effect was immediate. After it came online, the Air Force shot down 26 MiGs while losing only 6 aircraft of all types to enemy fighters. The most careful analyses of the period identify that warning capability, not any change in flying skill, as the defining factor in the Air Force turnaround. Technology mattered elsewhere too. The Phantom finally received an internal cannon, and that gun accounted for 5 or 6 kills during the campaign, depending on how they are counted. A new identification device allowed crews to distinguish a MiG from a friendly aircraft beyond visual range, which finally let them use the radar-guided missile the way it had been designed to be used. An improved Dogfight variant of the Sparrow entered service, and even that one missed far more often than it hit. 100 of them were launched in the last 4 months of the campaign for 5 confirmed kills. There is a further asymmetry here that almost never gets mentioned, and it matters for the same reason. The training gap matters. The two services were not carrying the same weapons. The Navy had the better Sidewinder variants. The Air Force was still working with an older model that managed 6 kills from 71 launch attempts across most of 1972. Some of the difference in performance between the two services in that year was not skill and not doctrine, it was hardware, issued by 2 separate procurement chains that had made different decisions years earlier. And the opposition itself had degraded. By late 1972, the North Vietnamese fighter force had been fighting continuously for 7 years, had lost a large proportion of its experienced pilots, and was feeding replacements into combat faster than it could train them. Some part of the improved American exchange ratio reflects a weaker enemy rather than a stronger friend. 2 other things happened in 1972 that had nothing to do with air combat training and a great deal to do with the results. On May 9, American aircraft mined the approaches to Haiphong Harbor, closing the port through which the great majority of North Vietnamese war material arrived. Everything downstream of that decision, including fuel for fighters and missiles for air defense, tightened. And throughout the campaign, the Navy had something the Air Force spent years without, which was a radar picket ship in the Gulf of Tonkin providing continuous controlled intercept information to its crews. The Air Force eventually built an equivalent capability inland, and it transformed their results. The Navy had been operating with that advantage the entire time. The honest conclusion is narrower than the legend and more interesting. Exposing pilots to a real MiG-17 and then building a school around the lessons produced a demonstrable improvement in one service and no improvement at all in the other, because only one service did it. That is not a smaller claim. It is a cleaner one, and it is the version supported by the documents. The final accounting also requires taking apart one of the most durable stories of the air war. For decades, popular accounts described a North Vietnamese ace named Colonel Toom or Colonel Toon, credited with 13 American aircraft and supposedly shot down over Hanoi in 1972. He appears in books, in films, and in a great many documentaries. He also appears in no Vietnamese record of any kind. Historians now regard the name as an American construction, a composite assembled from radio intercepts and rumor, given a face because a formidable enemy is easier to fight when he has one. Even the 13 stars that supposedly marked his tally have a mundane explanation. They were painted on an airframe, not awarded to a man, and they represented the cumulative claims of everyone who had flown that particular aircraft. The real numbers are less cinematic and more instructive. North Vietnam acknowledges losing 131 MiGs in air-to-air combat across the war, of which 63 were MiG-17s, along with 49 MiG-17 pilots. Its own Air Force credits the MiG-17 force with 71 aerial victories, a figure the United States has never accepted. American records acknowledge substantially fewer. Neither side's tally reconciles with the others, and no historian has fully closed the gap. Every exchange ratio in this story carries the same warning label. The figures change depending on whether you count all aircraft types or only the fighters assigned to fighter sweeps, where the Marine Corps losses are folded into the Navy's column, and which months you include. Ratios quoted with confidence and without definitions should be treated with suspicion, including several that circulate widely today. What is not in dispute is what became of the aircraft this entire story turns on. After that summer, the MiG-17 essentially stopped being a factor in the air war. The type that had defined the low-altitude fight for 7 years was pushed aside, not because a better MiG replaced it, but because the specific advantage it had held over American aircrew had been measured, published within a closed circle, and then trained out of existence. Almost none of the men responsible got anything for it. Frank Ault's report reshaped Navy aviation, produced the school that produced the aces, and carried his name inside the service and essentially nowhere else. He retired, lived quietly in Virginia, and died in 2006, 84 years old. Outside naval aviation, his name is largely unknown, and the report that bears it has never been made into a film. Dan Pedersen, who built the school in 60 days out of a trailer and borrowed airplanes, spent the following decades watching a Hollywood version of his creation become one of the most recognizable brands in the world, while the men who actually founded it remain known mainly to each other. He commanded a carrier, retired, and eventually wrote his own account. Decades after the fact, and largely at the urging of others. Ronald McKeown, who spent the spring of 1969 in the cockpit of a captured MiG-17 teaching American pilots how it felt to lose, got the closing of the circle. On May 23, 1972, flying a Phantom from the carrier Midway with Lieutenant John Ench in the back seat, he met 2 MiG-17s over North Vietnam and shot down both. He had flown the airplane. He knew exactly where it could not follow him. Nguyen Van Bay outlived all of it. Grounded before the end of the war so that the state could keep its most famous pilot alive, he went home to the Mekong Delta and farmed. He grew lotus and raised fish. Visitors who tracked him down in the 1990s found a man in a garden who was mildly puzzled that anyone had come. Among the visitors was a former American Phantom pilot who had lost a squadron mate in the war bay, had helped fight. Bay died in 2019 at the age of 83. Asked once about his own reputation, he said that in Vietnam you meet heroes wherever you go. None of them chose the moment that mattered most. 2 Syrian lieutenants with the wrong charts did. The institution built out of those 5 months in Nevada never went away, and it is easier to see today than it was then. The idea that a pilot should learn to fight an airplane unlike his own, flown by someone trained to fight like the enemy, hardened into permanent American practice. The Air Force stood up its first dedicated aggressor squadron in 1972 and created a large-scale realistic exercise program at Nellis in 1975. In 1977 it went further and established a secret squadron to fly genuine Soviet fighters, including MiG-17s, out of a remote Nevada range. That unit flew for roughly a decade before it stood down, generating more than 15,000 sorties and putting close to 6,000 American aircrew in front of a real MiG. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged until 2006. The successors are still flying. Aggressor squadrons operate today at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada and at Eielson in Alaska, one of them equipped with 5th-generation fighters so that American pilots can train against a threat that does not yet exist in an adversary's inventory. The Navy School moved to Fallon in Nevada in 1996 and now sits inside a larger warfighting development center, still producing tactics instructors, still using the same underlying principle. Private companies now sell adversary flying as a service. The Vietnam People's Air Force also survived, and it flies Russian equipment to this day. Its combat strength rests on a few dozen Sukhoi-built multi-role fighters, supported by an aging fleet of older Soviet types being retired and a training fleet that has recently been modernized. It is a small force with a long institutional memory. But the sharpest measure of how far the ground has shifted is what Vietnam has been buying lately. In late November of 2024, the United States delivered its first 5 Texan trainers to the Vietnamese Air Force, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable for most of the past half-century. In April of 2025, a defense trade publication reported, citing a former United States government official and several industry sources, that Vietnam had agreed to acquire at least 24 American-built F-16 fighters. Neither the White House nor the Pentagon confirmed it, no formal congressional notification of such a sale had appeared, and it should be treated as one publication's reporting rather than settled fact. If it holds, the Air Force that built its reputation, shooting down American fighters, will fly them. The hardware changed completely. The arithmetic did not. The question that Groom Lake answered in 1969, which is what happens when one side's tactics are written against an enemy it has never actually flown against, is exactly the question every Air Force is now asking about opponents it has never met either. For 4 years, an obsolete Soviet fighter beat the most advanced Air Force in the world in one narrow band of sky, and it did so because that Air Force had convinced itself the band of sky no longer existed. The correction did not come from industry, or from a laboratory, or from any of the enormous programs that consumed American defense spending in that decade. It came from putting American pilots in a losing fight on purpose, where losing cost them nothing but their confidence, and doing it often enough that the lesson became reflex. 2 young Syrian officers gave that away for free on a summer afternoon and had no idea what they had done. The airplanes they left behind sat in a hangar on a dry lakebed for 5 months, and by the time they were rolled back inside, the war in the air over North Vietnam was already being decided somewhere else, in a trailer at Miramar by 9 men with no budget and a syllabus written in 60 days.